last time we had looked at solving quadratic equations using the square root property and also using completing the square. Today we're going to look at solving quadratic equations, a more general form of solving quadratic equations, using what we call the quadratic formula. And what this formula says is the solution to a quadratic equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is the standard form of a quadratic equation where a, b, and c are real numbers and a is not equal to 0. So the solution to this equation, or solutions, and notice we could have one solution, two solutions, or no solutions, as we've seen, is given by this formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So you might be wondering, how do I get this formula from this equation? And we're going to look at deriving this formula, deriving the quadratic formula, which is a very important formula in math. We're going to look at deriving this formula from the quadratic equation. And the process we're going to use is completing the square. Let's take a look at that. So to derive the quadratic formula, what we need to do is solve this quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 for x. We want to solve this equation for x. The first step, remember we're going to use completing the square. The first step is to move this constant to the other side. In other words, I'm going to subtract c from both sides. And so we end up with ax squared plus bx equals negative c. Now remember we need the lead coefficient to be 1. So I want to get rid of that a in front of the x squared. To do that, what I have to do is divide everything by a. So we divided everything by a, and so what's going to happen is a over a here will cancel, and we'll have x squared plus b over ax equals negative c over a. Now remember, when we were completing the square, what we did was we took half of this middle term and we squared it. So half of b over a, what's b over a, what's half of b over a? B over 2a. So we make a note here, we're going to take b over 2a and we're going to square that, and we're going to add that to both sides. Like this. And the next thing we do, the next step, remember the next step was to factor the left side. And how did we factor this? Now this is now all abstract a's and b's, we don't know what these numbers are. But remember, it factored into x plus half of this all squared. So if we factor the left side, what we're going to have is x plus b over 2a times x plus b over 2a. So this is the factorization of this expression on top here. And you could check that by folding this back out. Remember, we'd have x squared, and then b over 2a times x plus b over 2a times x would give you b over a plus times x. And then b over 2a times b over 2a gives me b over 2a squared. So you might want to check it by folding it back out to make sure that verify to yourself that this is the factorization of the above expression. And on the right side we'll have negative c over a plus b over 2a squared, just from above. Okay, now this expression here can be written as x plus b over 2a all squared. And we have to simplify the right side a little bit, so I'm going to simplify this right side. I'm going to square this out. So what do we end up with in the right side if I square this out? Well, we have negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. Because if I squared b here, b squared, and squared 2a, we get 4a squared. So this is the right side. And on the left side, we're still going to have x plus b over 2a squared. The next step is to square root both sides. And also we have to simplify this right side by adding the fractions. So I'm going to rewrite this on top here. We're going to go back up here. Make sure you follow these steps so far. And we're going to go back up to the top and finish this off. So we have on the left side the square root of x plus b over 2a all squared. And then on the right side we had the square root of negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. One addition, this should be plus or minus the square root on the right side. Because remember, according to the square root property, when you square root both sides, you either have the positive or negative root on one of the sides. okay, according to the square root property. It can either be the positive root or the negative root. And remember, we're solving an equation, so we're using that square root property. So the left side, when you square root a square, you end up with what's being squared, x plus b over 2a. And on the right side, I'm going to simplify this square root a little bit. I want to combine these fractions here. So notice I have an a here as the denominator and a 4a squared here as the denominator. So I need, the common denominator is 4a squared. So I need to multiply both top and bottom of this term here by 4a. And that will give me 4a squared in both denominators. So let's do that. So we have 4a on the top, 4a on the bottom. So here we'll have negative 4ac, and on the bottom we'll have 4a squared. And now if I combine these, I have the same denominator now. I'll just have negative 4ac plus b squared over 4a squared underneath the root. And I'm actually going to put the b squared in front. So I'm going to put b squared minus 4ac instead of having negative in front. So that ends up being plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. Now remember, this whole thing is underneath the square root. Okay, and on the left side we have x plus ba. X plus b over 2a. So there are two things we're going to do now. The first step is we're going to move this over here by subtracting it from both sides. Subtract b over 2a from both sides. Then we'll have x equal to something. And then also, I'm going to simplify this a little bit more, this square root. I can square root the bottom. Remember, I could split this square root into two square roots. I could split this up into the square root of the top, the square root of b squared minus 4ac, divided by the square root of 4a squared. So I'm splitting up the square root so I can square root the denominator. If I do that, if I square root the denominator, I get, what's the square root of 4a squared? 2a. Okay, so we're going to do two things here. We'll move this over and then have a 2a over here. So what we have now is x equal negative b over 2a. So remember, I subtracted b over 2a from both sides, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, square root of b squared minus 4ac, over the square root of 4a squared, but the square root of 4a squared is just 2a. So this is the quadratic formula. We've solved it for x. X is equal to this. However, there's one more simplification that we can do. Notice here we have the same denominator, 2a and 2a. So we can just add these two fractions, combine these fractions, and have it sitting over one denominator. In other words, we have x equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And that is the quadratic formula. That is the quadratic formula. That's the formula we've been looking for to derive, and so we've derived this formula using completing the square. And you'll find this formula is extremely useful. It's extremely useful to solving any quadratic equation. So it's something you want to commit to memory. That the solution to ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 is given by x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.